Make sure the red lights are flashing. There he goes. I put it up on the website so you can get to the first lesson, first class. And it's pretty neat. I got my wife the Apple TV thing. I don't know if she's used it. She likes to, I thought she used it to watch, you know, stuff from her iPad on the television, but I think she likes to watch a football game and watch her shows on the iPad, so that's not working out. But you can see YouTube stuff from the Apple TV, and I thought that was pretty neat because it'll show it on your TV, and it looks pretty good, actually. Today, I promised you, you know, we had the introduction to cultures and literature, and we'll be talking about cultures and literature through the whole point, because the class is all about, you know, the writing, the language, the history, and the culture. And I mentioned before, if you have theological questions, go ahead and ask them. We'll look at it from a historical basis. But, you know, the point of the class is to introduce you to something that's new and different. It's not a question about, oh, what do I think about things, or what do you think about things? It's rather a question of what can we prove is truth, what do we know is true about the writing, about the history, and about the culture. And in most cases, we haven't ever learned these things, which is very unfortunate and very sad. I'm going to show you something today that was done in every class of history until about the turn of the 20th century. After the turn of the 20th century, now you can figure out why they don't do this anymore, but it may be self-indicative to you, but they used to teach everybody this way. And we're going to learn a method to know truth. One of the methods. There's 3 methods to know truth. We're going to learn about one of them today. But in doing that, I wanted to look at some representative words in Greek. Here's your Greek. Like I said before, if you couldn't read this, that's okay. This is, it's Greek to me too. A-L-E-T-H-E-I-A-S. Aletheus. Aletheus means truth in Greek. The problem is, remember Greek, I haven't got into great details yet about this, but Greek is basically a geometrically based language. The Greeks, for some reason, think geometrically. Their language is very concrete. The language is very geometrical. So does anybody remember from geometry? When you were in geometry, remember what was geometry all about in school? About theories, right? You wanted to prove that an isosceles triangle had 3 equal sides or whatever, right? But what could you not prove in geometry? Does anybody remember? This is like one of the, look, if you didn't get this out of geometry, I'm sorry. You lost it, you know? This was one of the main things they taught you in geometry.
It's been a while.
It's been a long time, I guess, right? Nice. Well, you look pretty young there. Come on, guys. The one thing that you couldn't do is you could not prove a true. You cannot prove a true in a geometric proof, in a mathematical proof, right? You can prove a not true. You can prove a not true. You cannot prove a true. This is the reason it's a real problem, for example, to prove God, right? You know, the whole history of philosophy until the 20th century was to try to prove God. But why is it difficult to prove God? Because I can't prove a true. I can only prove a not true. We know this from geometry and mathematics. So guess what the word in Greek is for truth?
Not false.
Not false. A is in Greek, A generally, not always, but generally means not. And Aletheus, not false. So the Greeks have a word, their word for truth means not false. And the reason is because they're a geometrically based culture, which is really wild. We're going to learn more about this because every time we touch it. So what do you have to do if you're Greek and you meet all these other cultures? And in Koinean Greek, you know, I do Athenian Greek, but we're talking about Koinean Greek in the New Testament documents. So when we're talking about the Greek, you know, if you're a Greek culture and you begin interacting with other cultures, what do you immediately find a need for? A word that means truth, right? A word that means truth. And so what they did is they borrowed a word from Hebrew. This word, A-M-E-N. Amen. But unfortunately, amen doesn't really mean truth. There is no word for truth in Hebrew. Amen means I agree with you. So this is a huge step for the Greeks, right? In the Greek mindset, what do the Greek want to know? What's the Greek want to know? What's truth, right? But what does the Hebrew want to know? Do you agree with me? Does this sound like our culture? In our culture, what do we got here, right? It's like, do we care what truth is?
No.
No, we care about, do you agree with me? And we feel better if you don't, right? What an interesting culture that is. Isn't it interesting that we are really close to Hebrew culture in some ways? Remember, I told you, English is a euphemistic language, where Greek is a very concrete language. And so we're going to see this all the time. Now, the Greeks were pretty smart. The people, okay, was it the Greeks or was it the people using the Greek language? That's a great question. We find the Greek usage of these terms because when they found terms they liked, kind of like us, right? How do we have 1,000,000 words in English? Right? Yeah, you know, kamikaze comes from the Greek. No. Right? Remember that guy? Remember my Greek wedding? All the words come from Greek, right? Yeah, kimono, right? Takasawa, whatever. But, in Greek you can find this borrowing of words to make more clear. Because the Greek's very important. We talked about last week, how many words do we have for say and said? About 10, 12, 14, right? And so the Greeks were very concerned about communication. And so that's what we get. Now this one, I just throw this out, alethos. Alethos is like aletheus, it's basically the same word, but this is a word that is translated in the Bible as verily, verily, or truly, truly I say unto you. So truth, amen, I agree with you, or actually not false, I agree with you, and verily, verily. Just very interesting because we see these words over and over and over again in the New Testament. I threw these in, I really should give them to you in a different class, but Biblia and Membranus. Biblia, all right, we see this word and we think, no, it's papyrus. A Biblia is a stack of papyrus sheets or a papyrus sheet. And I'm not going to talk about it today, but I'll talk about when we talk about Greek literature, Greek writing. I get more in detail about Biblia. And then Membranus. Membranus is, anybody remember what membranus is? Membrane. We get membranes, but it's basically the writing that's done on animal hide, skin. So there's a word for that, though, in English.
Vellum?
Vellum, yeah. Vellum. So, Membranus and Biblia. And why this is important is because we find both words used in the New Testament. Biblia used for papyrus sheets put together, and Membranus used for basically Torah scrolls or things on vellum. But I'm not going to get into that. What I want to talk about today is veracity. The veracity of the text. So, like, for example, every time you walk into a classroom in history, what should the teacher be doing for you? The first thing.
Demonstrate veracity.
Well, you should prove the text. What are you going to use for text? Well, let's talk about this a little bit. Can anyone tell me, how do we know truth? Now, don't tell me you can't know truth. Because you got to be able to know truth, right? And there are 3 methods to know truth. So, can anybody tell me the 3 methods to know truth?
Scientific method.
Scientific method.
Historical.
The historical legal method.
Logic.
Legal. And logic. Now, I'm not going to get into logic. I've done that in other classes. What we're going to focus on are the 2 methods that we know best. We're going to talk a little bit about the scientific method and then mostly about the historical legal method. The thing is that most people, almost everyone's taught the scientific method today. I can use a scientific method to prove what? A repeatable event. If the event is repeatable, I can use a scientific method. Why? Because the scientific method says, what do you do in a scientific method? Well, I start with a theory, right? A theory. And then I do what? I make an experiment. And then what? I do tests. I observe the results, right? And then I make conclusions. The point is this. My theory, my experiment, and the test, every time I do the test, it has to come out similar, right? I can't say the same because it's never the same, but it needs to be similar. So every time I mix vinegar and soda, I get carbon dioxide and bicarbonate together, right? Otherwise, the world is not right. See? Right? Otherwise, we're in magic. Right? So in the scientific method, I can use the scientific method to prove repeatable events. But I have a problem there. Was that last moment repeatable? Was the moment before that repeatable? History's not repeatable. I mean, we like to say history repeats itself, but does it really? No, of course it doesn't. We're marching to the end. We're marching forever. And it's never repeatable. So how do I prove historical things? I use, just like the scientific method, I also have a method called the legal historical method. The legal historical method, basically, let me tell you, you guys, it's used every day in America. Because the legal historical method is the method that I use to put people in jail or to exonerate them of crimes. It's also called the witness evidentiary method. And so we use the witness evidentiary method to prove truth in the world, period. And people want to say, well, that's not a good way to prove truth. But guess what? Do you have any other choices? The Greeks invented this 2,500 years ago. And are you willing? Are you going to throw out the scientific method?
No.
That's dumber than dirt, right? Are you going to throw out the historical legal method?
No.
You won't have courts anymore. You won't have court systems. And guess what? If there's no legal historical method, guess what we don't have? No history. No science either. Because what do scientists do with their results?
They publish them.
They write them down, right? They publish them. Can I prove? I can prove their results using the scientific method, but can I prove the history of their papers using the scientific method? No. Let me talk about this. Let's get this. Let's move into something very simple. Let's look at it very simply. How do you prove history? How do you prove history? That's what we're talking about. How do you prove history? So pick somebody in history that you know really exists.
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great. How do you know?
From history.
Witnesses and texts.
Historical records.
The effects of what he did.
Yeah.
The effects.
Archaeology.
Archaeology. Do you know there's more proof that Jesus existed than Alexander the Great? But Alexander the Great had, well, he had a great effect on history, but so did Jesus. But Alexander the Great's a good example. Let's pick one a little bit later. Pick somebody a little bit later.
George Washington.
George Washington. George Washington. Oh, let's pick, well, there's no photography yet of George Washington. Pick somebody a little bit later.
Calvin Coolidge.
Calvin Coolidge. How many know Calvin Coolidge is alive? Was alive. You got pictures, right? You have pictures. We have books. We have other things. You know, how do you know? It's because you have basically evidence, some type of evidence. And that's what we're talking about, evidentiary method. So when we talk about legal historical method, how do we know that Calvin Coolidge, for example, lived in the world? What evidence do we have? I mentioned photographs.
Witnesses.
Witnesses are dead, so what kind of witnesses will we have?
Well, the ones that
First
wrote it down, but
Yeah, written accounts, right? Written. Somebody saw him. Did he write anything? Yeah, he wrote stuff. He wrote his own stuff. You have written accounts. How about paintings? Got paintings?
news accounts.
News accounts. It's a written account. News, biographies, autobiography or auto stuff that he might have written, things like that.
Census and other data. Census, he was when recorded records of births, marriages.
Yeah, records. Any videos? No. Any they got
Some movies.
movies, might have been movies, yeah, movies. You know. Okay, so I have these accounts. Now we use tests to test this. We have tests that enable us to test this, to make sure they're good. And so the test that we use, we always apply to any documentary evidence. Let's start with, for example, in a criminal case. In a criminal trial, if I have a witness, let's say I have a person that saw it, a witness, whether it's written or not. It doesn't matter if it's written, it doesn't matter what kind of witness, but the witness, we talk about 3 levels of witness of a witness. Anyone ever heard of hearsay evidence? What's hearsay evidence?
Someone told me they saw something.
Somebody told me they saw something. Now, this might be a news to you, but all news media are hearsay. All news media are hearsay. Okay? So what other type of witnesses do I have? First-hand witness, an eyewitness. We call an eyewitness. In history, we call this a primary witness, one with a little degree sign. Hearsay is secondary. And then we have a third one, tertiary. What's tertiary? Anything that isn't primary or secondary. Tertiary, you know, every history book you ever read is a tertiary witness. Now, what do you think historians do with that? What do historians study to study about history?
But that's not likely.
No historian touches tertiary documents. Historians write tertiary documents. They don't study them. All historical studies are done with primary and secondary documents. Eyewitness accounts or secondary accounts. Tertiary accounts are considered nothing. I also like to talk about quaternary accounts. Quaternary accounts, in my mind, are accounts that do not even try to attribute themselves to history. There are that kind of writing. Like what? Like novels. Well, novels can actually, but you're right, novels could fill into that. Some novels can be good history, though. Oliver Twist, Dickens, you have to be cautious because they put stuff that they want in there, right? But yeah, it can be good history. You can get some history out of that, especially about culture and things like that. But documents that are quaternary are like, for example, the opinion page of the paper. It's someone's opinion. Do you care? Probably most people don't, you know. But you see my point? An opinion would be a quaternary document. It's really a tertiary document, most technically. But when we look at documents, we look at primary and secondary sources. Now, let's talk about antiquity. And this is what we call merit or degree. The merit or degree of witness. And obviously, what's the best witness? Eyewitness. Okay, and it goes downhill. And by the way, the other reason I leave quaternary in is because I would consider a quaternary document to be no witness at all. For example, there are a lot of texts that are no witness at all. They may be of some value historically, but they are generally no witness. And for example, poetry, some poetries, some religious documents. The Book of the Dead is a good example of that. The Book of the Dead is good historical information, but you know what the Book of the Dead is? Anybody know what the Egyptian Book of the Dead is? It's spells to use after you're dead. How do you test it? Okay, I want you to test it, Dave. Did I kill you? Did it work? I don't know. He didn't come back to tell me, So, I don't know. I consider it to be quaternary. I mean, it has some value, but what kind of value does it have? I don't know.
Fatal for the society, the mindset.
Cultural.
What their religious beliefs were.
Yeah, that's kind of correct, but really, what can you learn? Cultural, it may give you some idea of what they're thinking, but what are they thinking?
Pyramid.
I mean, really? Yeah, how can you build a pyramids with that kind of idea? I don't know. There's probably more value in the papyrus that it's written on, right? From a historical standpoint, but that's okay. That's okay. Anyway, let's talk about something very important. In antiquity, when we talk about documents in antiquity, because we're talking about the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. This is a book in antiquity. I'm going to tell you something may or may not have ever heard. There are no extant documents of any document in antiquity. What that means is there are no originals. There's no originals of any document in antiquity. Now what do you say? You say, what is antiquity? Antiquity begins, and this is it's kind of a scholarly thing, but about 600 AD is when we consider antiquity to end. So after 600 AD, and by the way, anybody know why 600 AD? What's with 600 AD? The Muslim. Because the book of Quran, there are some original copies of the book of Quran. Now they're all different. Go figure. How can you have different documents from the same period, from the same time? But they are different, but they are considered originals of the Quran, and so that marks the end of antiquity. So after that point, we do have some documents where we have the originals. But before 600 AD, we have no extant documents. Or no, that's wrong, I'm using the wrong word. We have no existing originals. We have extant documents. Extant means we have existing documents, but we don't have any of the originals. So we do some tests with those documents. So for example, in Calvin Coolidge's era, we had the printing press, we had the ability to record data, we had, I don't know if we had microfiche, but we had the ability to reproduce and produce documents, right? And so you can find the originals of his writings, you can find the originals of books, etc., right? But what about the Book of Mark? The Book of Mark was before 600 AD. As a matter of fact, when did the events of Mark happen? About 5 BC, 5 to 6 BC to about 33, let's say 34 AD. And we believe, and see, I think I gave you in the notes, we think almost all scholars, there's very few scholars that don't agree that the book of Mark was written from 50 to 70 AD. I told you CE because it's common era before the common era. That's kind of used in academia nowadays. But from 50 to 70 AD. So that's before antiquity ended, right? We do not have any originals of Mark. We don't have any originals of Pliny, no originals of Socrates, no originals of Plato wrote Socrates' words down of Plato, of Aristophanes. No originals of any document prior to about 600 AD. Period. Done. None. None of Caesar, none of Marcus Aurelius or Alexander the Great. No documents. So that means that we have to do something. And we do this, we also do this in the modern era with modern documents. But we have 3 tests that we use. We use 2 of those tests with modern era documents, but we use 1 test with ancient documents, more with ancient documents. And those 3 tests are these. We have the bibliographical test. Bibliographical test. We have the internal test and the external test. So there are 3 tests. The one I'm going to talk about right now is the bibliographical test. Now, the use of bibliographical in this sense is more common to what we think bibliographical means. What does bibliography or bibliographical mean in English? Sources or library or a group of texts. And so bibliographical means as applied to written, a written language. Just like Bible or biblion. What's a biblion? A library, right? So a bibliographical test applies to the document itself. And so we're going to look at the document. So what do you think? How, if I'm looking at documents in antiquity, what method would I use to determine whether they are accurately relayed to us and that they are more trustable, that you can trust them better than another one?
First person.
Yeah, well, you look at, this is an internal test. It's eyewitness is an internal test. But how would I look at the document itself?
Documents.
Carbon dating?
See, I could say carbon dating or what's, no, there's even an easier way to do it than that. Okay, what if I have a lot of them?
Commonality.
If I have a lot of them, and I think I told you, see, for Mark, I have, Mark, there are 175 Greek manuscripts in Mark. 175. You know how many there are? Plenty of the younger?
Couple.
3. How about a Caesar?
0.
Well, I mean copies. Sorry, copies. There are 175 copies of the Greek manuscript of Mark, and there are 3 copies. There are 3 copies of the original of Pliny. How many is Caesar? I think Caesar's Wars. I think there's like 4, something like that. I got it in my notes. Let's see. I can tell you exactly. Catalyst. There are 3 copies of Catalyst. Pliny the Younger, I'm sorry, there's 7. There's 7 of Pliny the Younger. Plato Tetralogies, there are 7. Euripides, there are 9. Aristotle, there's 10 of all of his documents. Sophocles, there's, Caesar, there's 10. Sophocles, there's, of Aristotle, there's 49. Of Sophocles, there's 193. In antiquity, Sophocles is about the best we got of non-biblical documents. That's a lot. Now, what does that allow you to do if you have that many copies?
Compare them.
You can compare them, yeah. There's a book, and I don't know if I brought it with me. Did I bring it with me? Yeah. Here's the majority text. Majority text is Greek. The majority text compares all the documents and gives you the majority view of the scholars to what the text actually is. And down in the footnotes, it tells you where there's issues. Most of the time, the issues are, for example, declensions of nouns and verbs. You know, how's the noun and verb used? And, you know, is it plural or not plural? What kind of article is used within the context? Sometimes it's spelling. You know, there's issues with spelling, right? When was the first dictionary invented? You know who did it? Ben Jonson invented the first dictionary back in 19th century, right? And then our guy, who's our guy? Our guy, Webster came out with his dictionary not long after that because he thought that Ben Jonson was too cavalier with the use of language, which he was. But that's okay. Before that, nobody knew how to spell anything, right? And you find variants in spelling like crazy.
Like texting.
So with 175 different copies, what do you expect to see? Variants in spelling, variants in the use of verbs, etc. However, you know, just to make you feel good, there's very little differences between the documents. They're basically the same. There's stuff we get, like, for example, the woman caught in adultery. You know, it's not found in early, but it's found in Mark, it's found in John, and it's found in Luke. And none of the early documents. And also, there's an added section in Mark, at the end we'll look at, that just appeared there later. See? So the earliest documents don't include that section. So most likely, the woman caught in adultery was added later, and also the end of Mark was added later. When? We don't know. But it was obviously added between the earlier documents we have and later documents. But we have 175 documents, and in history, 175 documents in Mark is very good, fantastic. Matter of fact, for most documents, we only have 1. If we only have 1, there's no comparison, you don't know. So when we look at documents in antiquity, we see that we have a lot. This is a very positive thing. The other thing we look at is, how about if we look at the distance between the time in which the document was written? Let's see, here's when the events occurred, 5 BC to 34 AD. And then we think it was written between 50 and 70 AD. What if the earliest manuscript we had was written in 1000 AD? Was copied in 1000 AD? What would you think?
A little room for error.
Yeah, iffy, right? Guess what? The earliest document in antiquity other than the biblical documents is, let me see, I got it in my notes right here.
It's also on your piece of paper
It's probably my piece of paper. The earliest we have is Pliny the Younger, 750 years from, and I think that was around 1000 AD. It's, no, the earliest copy is 850 AD, so monks were writing it, but it's 750 years between the time it was written and the earliest document. Now in the New Testament for Mark, let's see, I gave you a date. The earliest manuscript we have is from 225, although there are some pieces, we have some pieces from earlier, but about 225. So 225 compared to 750, 225, and that's 225 minus this amount, right?
Potentially 3 lifetimes.
So let's say, yeah, what is that, 175? 175 years compared to 750. Now, for John, as a comparison, John, we have a document, a full John from 130 AD. And we think John was written about 90 or so. 40 years. So, the closer you are to the writing with the manuscript and the closer you are to the period, the better the document, right? So we apply these two tests. These two tests are always applied to historians to know whether a document meets the bibliographical test. And guess what? I'll just give you a freebie. Every document in the New Testament meets this criteria better than any other document in antiquity. By magnitudes.
Perhaps that's why they were chosen.
Well, actually, we will find, if we get to that point, that is exactly why they were chosen by the early people. Matter of fact, we'll see some evidence. As a matter of fact, does anybody remember the name of the earliest Christian document that we can identify? The Didache. Yeah, the Didache is the earliest Christian document we can identify. And guess what? It may be talked about in Mark. We'll see that as we get into Mark. But the Didache, anybody got a Didache in their Bible? No, guess where it is?
On the pew.
It's on the pew. In every liturgical and non-liturgical, every church in the world that's Christian church uses the Didache in one way or another. Because it was assimilated early, and number one, is assimilated early, and number two, it's a book of doctrine. What did the early founders of Christianity not want in their documents? What did they want? They were looking for history. History. It's historical. These guys are as smart as us. They were looking for historical legal. And so they didn't want doctrine. They had plenty of doctrine. Doctrine's opinion, right? What they wanted was history. And that's what we find throughout the history of the New Testament documents, Old Testament documents. The purpose of the documents was not to teach you a lesson. The purpose of the documents was to tell you the history of the time, period. That's the purpose, see? So, the history of the points. So anyway, if we look at the history, then the Mark passes the bibliographical test perfectly. In fact, I gave you some information on there about them specifically. And if you compare the span, basically the New Testament on average, there are 24,000 copies of the New Testament in general.
Up to what date?
Up to antiquity.
Okay.
About 600 AD. They're when we say manuscripts, we mean handwritten copied manuscripts. So there are approximately 24,000 of those handwritten copies or manuscripts. And then of those, the average of span from the New Testament is about 100 years or so. That's the average from the original writing to the original manuscript. So compare that to anything else in antiquity. The best is Pliny the Younger at 750 years. We're talking almost a magnitude. We're talking almost a magnitude in numbers when we talk about numbers. So in general, I gave you some stuff here. I didn't include a whole lot of other works, but I gave you the New Testament documents, and I just assure you that these are much better bibliographical numbers than anything else. Then you might ask yourself the question, okay, if I go to Friends or Newman University, what are they teaching when they teach New Testament era? What do they use? Josephus. Josephus, the earliest documents, about 1,000 years. We have 51 copies of Wars, and we have, I think, 70-something copies of histories of the Jews. Most of the histories of Jews, he wasn't there. It's like the whole thing. So the whole Shemo Lola. So, you know, very little of the modern era. The Wars, a little bit better, but he was writing about stuff he never saw. So you might ask yourself the question, why is Friends of Newman using Josephus as their primary account for the history of the times? Now the thing that people always ask is they say, well, don't we reject these documents because they have miracles in them, right? They have apparent miracles, they have all these wondrous things happening, virgin births, all this kind of stuff. Okay, then you might ask yourself the question, when someone asks you this question, say, then why don't we reject Caesar? Do you know why? Caesar writes accounts about miracles. So does Herodotus. So does Pliny. So does Plato. Plato says that Socrates went to the oracle at Delphi and had an oracle. Is that a miracle? It's an oracle from the gods. So you're going to throw out Plato, right? Some of the arguments in Plato are about gods, about the gods. You're going to throw that out? All the plays that they teach your children, the Greek plays, all the Greek plays were written for religious festivals, and they're about the gods. You're going to throw them out? What I'm telling you is this. In every document in antiquity, what are you going to find? Miracles. Some of them talk about virgin births. Some of them talk about maybe the deity of Caesar, right? Caesar was deified. Do you believe this? You're going to throw it out, right? Livy, who was a historian, a Roman historian who wrote about Caesar, wrote about Alexander the Great, talks about the deification of these guys. You're going to throw them out? So why do historians pick the Bible, the New Testament documents, for example, and say, well, we're not going to use them historically? But yet, all these other documents, you know, historically have the same issues. Oh. Maybe the same reason they don't teach the legal historical method anymore. Because if I teach the legal historical method, what's my conclusion? Well, I got to use the New Testament documents, right? I got to use Mark to teach about that century. Now let's talk a little bit about Mark. Is Mark a primary source document? It is a secondary source document. Mark was, and also, here's a beautiful one. Okay, if you were early Christianity, right? And by the way, Christianity is not a good word to use. I'm going to teach you, I don't remember which class it is. I work all my classes way early. But the real word, what is the real name for these guys?
Teen Hodos.
Teen Hodos. The way. Teen Hodos. I write in Greek for you, but you can't read Greek, right? The way. The way. They did not call themselves Christians. We'll talk about this. We'll get deep into this because this is a huge thing. But Christians did not call themselves Christians until about 200 or 300 AD. Who call them Christians?
The Greeks.
The Greeks called them Christians. So, you know, when we talk about these documents, we're talking about Teen Hodos documents, the way, which were the Greeks and the Jews, and by the way, Romans, mostly Greek speakers, all of them. Now, this was a secondary source, and the way we know that is because we're using which proof? We're using the internal test. The internal test, once we get done with the bibliographical test, by the way, according to historians, if a work passes the bibliographical test, well, oh, by the way, when you rack and stack historical documents, which documents go on the top of the stack?
New Testament documents.
Well, in general. Those that pass the bibliographical test, the best, right? So if I stack documents, and maybe I should do this for a class sometime, but if I start stacking documents and say, okay, the bibliographical test, they pass, so I start stacking them, and I say, okay, I think I gave you an example. We can do it really quickly with these. I say, okay, I look at Matthew. How many do I have? Manuscripts. I have 940 copies of Matthew and Luke, about 940. Of John, I have 1890. 1890, and John. Yeah, John is right on the top.
So we go John,
Then I go John, and then I look at
Luke and Matthew.
Luke and Matthew, about the same. So Luke, Matthew,
Paul.
and then yeah, the Pauline stuff. Let's skip Paul. We got Mark. We got Paul in here someplace.
Could we
Dave.
skip him?
Well, just for this second.
Just for a moment.
But then all the other ones. Where am I putting Josephus?
Well, he's kind of down there.
He's down here someplace, and Pliny and Josephus. Okay, now you realize that if a work, you do this historically. You rack and stack the works. And the works at the top are what?
So how are we going to prove the bibliographic?
They're more authentic. They're more authentic, right? Because you know that they were accurately passed down to you, right? You know the accuracy of what was passed down is correct, is better, right? And because they're closer to the source, you know that they're better, right? Now, what can knock them off the list?
Inconsistencies.
There's only one thing that can knock them off the list, and that is, yes, inconsistencies. And first I look on the internal test. In the internal test, I look at the primary, secondary, or tertiary. So if they're primary and secondary and I'm a historian, I say,
Go for no one.
yay. If they're Josephus and tertiary, what do I say? But I'm going to use it anyway for my freshman classes. Right? Because you don't know any better because you haven't been taught. Right? So I can voice anything on you if you haven't been taught. Right? So, and also I'll sell you my history book that I wrote for like $300 and you have to buy it because it's my class. See? I got this. You got this figured out already? You see how this works? Okay. So if it's a primary or secondary, which goes on the top of the chart? Primary. So we look at John. Is John primary?
Yes.
Oh yeah, John is primary. How about Luke?
No.
Luke is secondary, and Matthew is a primary. So Matthew goes above Luke. Mark is a secondary, right?
Well, partially primary.
Where's Josephus? Josephus is tertiary. Pliny. Now some of Caesar's primary. That's pretty cool. They move him up a little bit, but he's still way down here, right? So the only thing that can move you up is now if you find internal problems. So internal problems. What are internal problems? Okay, primary, secondary, tertiary. So like I said, if they're tertiary, they go to the bottom, right? The primaries all go up the top. The secondaries are after that. The tertiaries way at the bottom. Then I look at it geographically. Geographically. If Mark was living in New York and he wrote about stuff happening in Palestine, what would you say?
Half the Jews are in New York. That's what I'd say.
Not
Good
then.
source.
Not then. Not then.
No. Rest
Right?
of them are in Miami.
Right? You know, I mean, Herodotus, you know, he was supposed to have gone to Egypt, but people are thinking now he didn't. So Herodotus was sitting fat, dumb, and happy in Greece writing about Egypt. Right?
Travel.
We don't know if he really did or not. He wrote a travel log. So, you see the point here? If it's geographically, if you have somebody writing, like, you know, there were a bunch of writers who wrote about stuff happening in Africa and Asia in the Middle Ages. And what did they show? Unicorns, one-eyed cyclopses, people with one leg bouncing around, right? They never saw it, right? They had, who knows where they got their ideas. See? So that's what you look for is internally, is the work, you know, geographically. How about chronologically? You know, it's chronologically. How about the historical claims? You know, number one, if the book passes this test and it's pertinent within a primary or secondary, if the author claims to be history, what do you do in history? You say, yeah, right? Because number one, how many sources do you have? Not a lot. But even so, you accept and trust the document until what happens?
Prove it otherwise.
Until it's proven otherwise. Now, internally, there is only one way to prove internally that it doesn't meet that criteria.
Inconsistencies.
Well, inconsistencies and incohesiveness. And when I say, now, I should do it, I didn't do it, I don't think I have any examples here, I should. Has anybody ever read the Gitas?
I tried.
Am I the only one? Has anybody read the Book of the Dead? Has anybody tried to read the Book of Manu? Or any of the Hindu works? Okay, look, don't. I can tell you, I've read them, and they're not worth reading, because they're incoherent. They're incoherent. I wish I had an example. I could give you a great example from Manu. Manu is one of the most coherent ones there is. And it talks all about how Manu, with his seed, created this and that, and the subconscious of the overman, of the underachievers, did this and did that. And so, you wonder how Zoroastrianism got a start. It's because no one could understand what the guys were talking about and said, hey, you must be a priest or something, right? So, it basically, in antiquity, many documents are incomprehensible. Now, some of you may say that Plato's works are incomprehensible, but that's not true. They have many logical arguments, okay? Stuff we're going to talk about in Mark. So they're not totally incomprehensible. You just need to read them a little closer. But has anybody read Mark? Okay. Is it comprehensible?
Yes.
Okay. You can read it. You can understand it. Even in a translation, it makes sense. In the original Greek, it makes even more sense. Okay. So if you've read the Old Testament, New Testament documents, especially New Testament documents, they are cohesive. They are comprehensible. They work. Right?
They're written in an 8th
I can guarantee you, and I need to do that. I keep forgetting. In some of my other classes, I brought examples, and when I read you the examples, you go, huh? You wonder how even people could stand to read that kind of stuff, because it's really strange. It's really strange stuff. In any case, the third test is the external test. And on the external test, what we do, and by the way, I just mentioned this, none of the New Testament documents indicate any internal contradictions. Let's see. Internal tests, I got all this stuff, okay, got this stuff. The external tests. External tests, I'll make a note here. External tests. What we do with external tests is we compare works in the same region, same time period.
That's hard to find.
And we do archaeology. Okay? So what can we compare the New Testament documents to?
Josephus.
Well, actually, there's a whole bunch. I don't have, let's see, do I have my list in here? Usually I have my list. Yeah. External authenticity, and I've got a lot more than this. Do you guys realize there are 44 Gospels? 44. There are only 12 extant, and there are only 4 that are considered reliable, historically reliable. Because how do you discover they're historically reliable? What do? You apply the bibliographical test, you apply the internal test, and you apply the external test. So we know of 44 Gospels. We have 12 extant copies of them. But only 4 pass the test. Did you know there are hundreds and hundreds of documents in this period that can be used to compare the New Testament documents to? It's not just Josephus. Although Josephus is the one that they're going to sell you for your freshman class instead of the New Testament documents. There are a lot more. Matter of fact, you have Eusebius, Pappus, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Josephus, and many, 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 many more. There's one reason why they don't usually give you Eusebius, Pappus, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, or Polycarp. Any reason why? You got an idea? Because they are apostolic fathers. They're the early Christian writers who wrote right after this period. This period is considered, the period of the New Testament documents is the 1st century. So from 0 to 100, in the century after that, there's a lot of writers, people that were born in this century that were eyewitnesses, that wrote stuff. But they never taught it to you. Someday I may teach class on that, but what I try to do is bring in other documents so you can see the comparisons. There are also a lot of other writers. Yeah.
Do they say that those people have a conflict of interest because they're, the church fathers, so obviously they want to get everybody to think that the New Testament is true. They have that agenda. Is that what they say?
Let me read you something that makes your point and the point that I want to make, because it'll answer the question. Josephus wrote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. As the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named for him, they are not extinct at this day." Josephus was writing this about 100 AD. Now, you know what modern historians say about this part, about this and a couple other things in Josephus.
It's added and edited.
They were added by Christians later. Because as you remember, the Christian documents, can you add much to them and not get caught?
A lot of copies to maintain.
There's a lot of copies to fix, right? But in Josephus, even though all the copies of Josephus have this in it, a lot of modern historians say, oh no, Josephus, who was a Jew, by the way, Jew paid by the Romans to write the history of the Palestinian era. With what kind of slant do you think?
Pro-Roman?
Oh, could be. And actually, who invited the Romans in?
The Maccabees.
The Maccabees did. Yeah. If you were in my Apocrypha class, in the Apocrypha we found out that the Jews asked him in. They asked those guys to come on and help them. They asked the Greeks too. And so what happened with that? Whoa. So, they asked them to come, right? They were there because the Jews wanted them. And then they got unhappy, I guess. We're going to find out there's huge political dimensions in this that you've got to realize. And we'll see this as we get into Mark. We'll see these political dimensions. Because it's not what you think. It's not what you think. We imagine that the world in the New Testament is simple and simplistic, don't we? It is anything other than simple and simplistic. It's much more complex in the modern era. I guarantee you. You may not have to have a passport. There's a lot of other stuff you got to worry about. So we'll see this. We'll see how this fits. Other Jewish accounts not only acknowledge the existence of birth of Christ, but actually try to attempt to discount the deity of Christ. What is very interesting is a lot of Talmudic. Talmud, I'm not going to go into the huge thing about the Talmud today, but the Talmud is basically the commentary on the Mishnah. It was not written down to about 100 AD. It was written down about 100 AD in Jerusalem and Babylon. There's Babylonian Talmud and then there's the Jerusalem Talmud. In the Talmud, there are some interesting stories, accounts about how Jesus' mother Mary was raped by a Roman soldier. And he even gives his name. I can't remember offhand. I got it in my notes someplace. But mentions his name. What does this indicate to you? It indicates 2 or 3 things.
They're responding to something.
Number 1, did Jesus exist?
Yes.
Yes. Number 2, what did everybody know about him?
Pretty big one.
Yeah, Joseph wasn't.
Joseph wasn't his father, and there was a claim that he was virgin birth. Number 3, Mary was his mother. And matter of fact, it even talks and was in Bethlehem. There's another account how he was a sorcerer that cured people in the Talmud. What does that prove?
That he was doing supernatural things that they have to try to explain away.
He was doing supernatural things, number 1. Number 2, that he existed. I've never met a legitimate historian that would say that Jesus did not exist. I mean, that's just irrational. There's more proof for Jesus existing than, for example, Buddha. The earliest writing of Buddha was over 100 years after his death. And which Buddha are you talking about? Because there's a bunch of guys identified as Buddha. And that's cool. But you just got to realize that the guys that wrote about Jesus were primary and secondary witnesses to the account, to what was happening. And by the way, Mark, we acknowledge Mark as a secondary witness, but Mark could have been a primary because many people think that Mark was the guy that ran away naked from the Mount of Olives, right? Many people think that, and that probably is true. Why? Because in ancient documents, you never said who you were. It's rare to say who you are. See? It's rare to mention your name if you are an author, unless it's a letter. But a historical account, you usually never told who it was. Let's see. Anything else? Archaeological. I don't have time to get into Turbingen School. Turbingen School is a really neat thing. I may talk about it, but for years and years and years, people said, well, we haven't found any evidence archaeologically of the New Testament, right? However, what do we know today?
Lots and lots.
Not only is there no contradictions externally between archaeology and the New Testament, we've actually found Pilate's name. You know, there are the Archcode documents, which are, in the Archcode documents are letters. In the Archcode documents are letters in the Vatican that were supposedly from Pilate to the Sanhedrin, and from Pilate to Herod, and from Pilate to the Senate at Rome. And so there is interesting evidence, and I may bring it up in the class. I'll try to show you some of that stuff. Evidence that is not good history, right? It doesn't pass the bibliographical test very well, and some of it has issues, right? But it's very interesting, because what would you have expected? Letters from Pilate, right? Right? So we do have some historical evidence. We have a lot of historical evidence that's non-biblical to Jesus, to the things that were happening in the New Testament era. So what I want you to do is contemplate the veracity of Mark, right? We proved it. Do you think? It's a trustworthy document that we can use to look at this period. And so that's what I want to do. We've set in place, we're introed, we've got veracity, we know that, and so now we can leap into it. But next week I want to talk about the literature, and then that will get into literature and the culture of the times, and also try to do a little bit of the Mark. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week and take care of us. In your name we pray, amen.